He was standing in the open doorway of the little cabin when he heard them in the distance, the sound of horses coming on hard. He tensed up and waited. It wasn't until they were streaming into the yard near the cabin that he saw the war paint. He heard the panic in his mother's voice as she shouted to his two younger sisters to go run and hide in the woods. She grabbed his arm and pushed him towards the woods, telling him to go get help. As he ran for the woods, he looked over his shoulder one last time and saw the mounted warrior shooting arrows into the cows and the pigs, killing them all. He ran as fast as he could through the woods. He didn't even feel the branches and the brush cutting against his skin, his face. He was in a panic. He was traumatized. He was sobbing. He needed to get to the river. Behind him, he could hear the sound of men shouting, animals crying out in pain, his mother screaming. The river was only about 1/2 mile away, so he got there quickly. But the river didn't look like this. It was December in Iowa. The river looked like this. The woods he just ran through, knee-deep in snow. The river, frozen. His plan was to use the river as a road and avoid the deep snow in the woods. He was going to run about 34 miles south to the small hamlet of Boone. He'd be able to get some help there. And so he started to run, and he ran, and he ran. And then he couldn't run anymore. At first, he fell to his knees, then onto his face, and then closed his eyes. And then 12-year-old Milton Lott, who had run a distance of about 25 miles without a coat, without a hat, without gloves, froze to death. Did Milton Lott's death, or those things that happened at the Lott cabin before his death, have anything to do with the Spirit Lake Massacre that occurred 8 years later in 1857? Some writers, some historians believe that the answer to that question is yes. This is that story, and it involves Inkpaduta. First, a word about Milton Lott's father, Henry Lott, the guy who owned a cabin that looked much like this and lived there with his wife and 4 children, including 12-year-old Milton Lott. Very bad man lived right over there on the north shore of the Boone River here. This is the Boone River. It flows just around that bend and empties into the Des Moines River. The man's name was Henry Lott. He's like central casting for a Western movie about the bad man on the frontier, a whiskey trader, a horse thief, a liar, and it turns out that he's also a killer. In the foreground, you can see the Boone River. To the right, that heavily wooded area, that's where the Lott cabin would have been in 1846. And if you look further up the Boone River, you'll see where it intersects with the Des Moines River. Now, as criminals go, Henry Lott was not the sharpest knife in the drawer. In December of 1846, he made a huge mistake. He stole some horses from a Dakota Sioux. In fact, the chief of one of the Wapakudi bands in the area, a man by the name of Inkpaduta. As you might recall from the last chapter, the Dakota Sioux did not sign the treaties until 1851 and were not required to live on a reservation until 1853. So in 1846, the various Dakota Sioux bands were moving around freely in both Minnesota and Iowa. It is likely that Inkpaduta had his camp somewhere around the Fort Dodge area, approximately 30 or 40 miles away from the Lott cabin. Inkpaduta was over 6 feet tall. He was well-built. I picture him looking something like this. He was an imposing man. And when he found out that Henry Lot stole some of his horses, he was the one who led the Dakota warriors to the Lot cabin on that December day in 1846. His goal? To make sure Lot left the country and never returned. And where was Lot that day when Inkpaduta and his Dakota warriors charged into the yard in front of the cabin? Well, he was either there when they first arrived or saw them coming. Either way, he jumped on a horse and made his escape, leaving his wife and children behind. Lot rode hard for about 40 miles to a place called Pease Point, about 4 miles south of Boone, where he met up with some of his gang, a renegade band of Potawatomis Indians, the people he ran around stealing horses with and selling whiskey. And he got some of them to join him and head back to the cabin. When he got back to the cabin, he found his wife huddled in the corner without a blanket, wearing nothing more than rags. She also appeared to be on the verge of both a physical and mental breakdown. Whatever happened to Sally Lot in that cabin with the Dakota Sioux when they attacked, and early writers said that she was, quote, ravaged to the point where she was losing her mind. She did, in fact, die 3 days afterwards. Cause of death? Not entirely clear. Watt and his Potawatomis renegade friends also found Lot's son, Milton, on the frozen river. They pulled him up onto shore and pushed him into a hollow log for safekeeping until the ground thawed and he could be buried. Lot returned later and buried his son. Milton's grave is still marked to this day, and he holds the distinction of being the first white person who died in Boone County, Iowa. It's not clear when Henry Lot decided that he was going to kill Inkpaduta, probably shortly after the raid on his cabin, but he was patient about it. Not long after the raid, he moved what was the rest of his family about 50 miles south to Des Moines, Iowa, where he remarried and lived for about 3 years until 1849. He then packed up the family and moved back to the original cabin. His second wife died in 1851, and in 1853, Lot did something that makes it obvious that he was seeking revenge against Inkpaduta. Lot became aware of the fact that Inkpaduta had his winter village about 25 miles northwest of Fort Dodge. So Lot packed up his family again, left the original cabin, and moved to an area much closer to Inkpaduta's camp. And then in 1854, just about 7 years after Inkpaduta attacked the Lot cabin, Lot did something that was pretty gutsy. He and his stepson rode into Inkpaduta's village and talked to the chief. They told him that they had seen a herd of elk nearby and invited him to go on a hunt. Inkpaduta did not recognize Lot and readily agreed, since game had been scarce lately and the tribe needed some food. And then Lot did something that was treacherous. They moved away from the village quite a distance, and at some point when Inkpaduta had his back turned, Lot shot him in the back and killed him. And then Lot did something that was horrendous. He and his stepson, who was also on the hunt, backtracked to Inkpaduta's village and shot and killed his elderly mother, 2 of his wives, and 2 of his 4 young children. One little boy was wounded and survived, and a little girl was able to hide. Lot then threw all of the bodies in a nearby creek in an effort to make it look like the Sac and Fox tribe had raided and killed his family. And then Lot took all of Inkpaduta's property and ran off with it, later selling it to settlers nearby. After that, Lot disappeared. This is where Inkpaduta enters this story. Inkpaduta was Inkpaduta's brother. Either real brother or blood brother, it probably doesn't make a lot of difference in the Dakota culture at that time. In fact, when Inkpaduta's father, who was the chief of the tribe, died, Inkpaduta could have claimed that position, but he readily agreed that it should be Inkpaduta who was the chief. In any event, it was Inkpaduta who discovered the bodies in the creek. In the Dakota world, when something like this happened, there would be a revenge raid. Inkpaduta would put together a war party, and they would get their revenge on whoever committed this atrocity. Here it would be the whites. But that's not what happened. Inkpaduta did something that was far different than that. Instead of a revenge raid, Inkpaduta went to the white authorities and sought justice for the murder of Inkpaduta and his family. And that took Inkpaduta to a little place called Homer, not far from Lot's original cabin. Homer was the county seat back in those days, a very small town, just a few buildings. But it did have a courthouse, or a courtroom, I should say, that I imagine looked something like this, including the dogs. This is what Homer, Iowa looks like today. At first, things looked good. A grand jury in Homer indicted Henry Lot, even though he couldn't be found, indicted him for murder. But then there had to be a hearing by a judge to determine whether or not charges should go forward. And that's when this guy, Granville Berkeley Sr., became involved. He was the prosecuting attorney. And for some reason, Mr. Berkeley and the judge decided to turn the hearing into a farce. They mocked and they mimicked the witnesses and their inability to speak English clearly. That included Inkpaduta and the two surviving children. Somewhere along the line, somebody severed the head of Inkpaduta, and Mr. Berkeley brought it into the courtroom, put it on the witness stand, and proceeded to question it. It was a complete and total farce. The judge ultimately decided that the evidence against Henry Lot was insufficient, and that it was more likely that renegade Indians committed the murders. Case dismissed. When the trial was over, the prosecutor, Mr. Berkeley, put Inkpaduta's head on a pole and stuck that pole in his front yard for all to see. One final sign of disrespect. This is probably a good time for me to formally introduce you to Inkpaduta. If you look on the internet, you're likely to see this picture identified as Inkpaduta. I'm convinced that is not him. It's not scary enough. You will also probably find this photograph, which was apparently taken of Inkpaduta shortly before his death in 1881. He would have been 66 years old at that time. However, there's some dispute about it. At least one author believes it's a photograph of his sister. I'm not sure who drew this picture of Inkpaduta, but I think the person nailed what Inkpaduta probably looked like in his prime at the age of 42 when the Spirit Lake Massacre occurred, based upon his description by settlers and others, including Abby Gardner. Settlers thought he was revolting and repulsive, with an ugly, vicious look about him. He was 6 feet tall, stout, broad shoulders, powerful frame, long face, and narrow, deep-set, black sparkling eyes, high nose, and a large mouth with squinty eyes. He was morose and sullen. The settlers saw him as scary and dangerous. And Abby, she described him as a monster in the form of a human being. He was deeply scarred by smallpox, and he looked vicious and dangerous. Inkpaduta was outraged about what happened at that trial, the lack of justice, the attitude that the prosecutor and the judge had to him and his family. He was furious over the fact that Sinto Inkpaduta was beheaded and how the prosecutor displayed his head on a pole in his yard after the trial. Settlers began noticing a change in Inkpaduta after the trial and the failure to find Lot. White settlers grew afraid of him even more so. One settler remembers Inkpaduta often talking about revenge for the killing of Sinto Inkpaduta. And Inkpaduta was never, ever as friendly to the whites after the murder and the trial. Some historians believe that Inkpaduta got his revenge raid after the death of Sinto Inkpaduta. It just took 3 years, and that raid occurred at Spirit Lake in 1857. Inkpaduta's sister was once asked about him. She said that he was a humble man who wanted to avoid trouble when possible, but when pushed or insulted, he could have a violent temper that could make him, quote, do things to the extreme. Then the innocent had to suffer with the guilty.